The silence in the federal courtroom was so thick you could hear your own heart pounding, a frantic, muffled drum against the cage of your ribs. It's a cold, sterile silence, the kind that only happens when something has gone terribly, publicly wrong. It hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating, absorbing all other sound. The opposing counsel, a man named Peterson in a cheap suit that hung poorly on his frame but was accessorized with an expensive, predatory smile, had just asked his question. His voice, a slick and oily thing, still seemed to ooze through the air, every syllable coated in a fake sympathy that was more insulting than open contempt. My former colleagues, Mark and Sarah, were smirking at their table, a shared look of triumph passing between them. They thought they'd won. After months of subtle torments and one final brutal act of betrayal, they thought they had finally, irrevocably broken me. But their eyes, like everyone else's in that cavernous room, weren't on me. They weren't even on Peterson, who stood preening in the center of the floor. Every gaze, every ounce of attention, was fixed on the woman on the elevated dais, the Honorable Judge Elizabeth Caldwell. Just moments ago, her face was a mask of stern neutrality, an impassive sculpture carved from decades of judicial practice. Now that mask had shattered into a million pieces. Her skin, usually a healthy olive tone, was ashen, the color of old parchment. Her lips were parted, as if to speak or to gasp, but no sound came out. The hand that had been holding the gavel, a symbol of her absolute authority, was frozen mid-air, trembling with a tremor that was just subtle enough to be horrifying. Her eyes, wide with a terror I couldn't begin to comprehend, were locked on me. It was an expression of such raw, naked shock that it felt like a physical blow. One joke, one cruel, thoughtless, career-ending joke had brought us all here, to this moment of absolute, deafening stillness, a moment that was about to unravel a lifetime of secrets buried so deep they were practically fossilized. But no one in that room, least of all me, could have possibly predicted that the person holding the key to unlocking everything was the judge herself. Just 1 week earlier, my life had felt like it was finally clicking into place, the disparate pieces of a complex puzzle finally aligning. I'm Amelia Harris, I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been an exercise in trying to fit those puzzle pieces together, pieces that were never meant to match. I am a black woman, but my world, my family, my home, my upbringing was entirely white. My parents, John and Mary Harris, adopted me as an infant. They are fundamentally good people, kind people, who wrapped me in a life of suburban privilege, a quiet, manicured world where the lawns were as uniform as the faces. They loved me with a fierce and protective passion. I never once doubted that. But their love was like a beautiful, hand-knitted blanket that couldn't quite warm the parts of me that always felt different. Theirs was a loving, determinately colorblind home, which is a beautiful idea in theory. In practice, it meant I was left to navigate the treacherous, complex terrain of my own racial identity completely on my own. It felt like they had handed me a meticulously drawn map to a country they had never even visited, a land whose language I was expected to somehow magically understand. Growing up, I was always the black girl. It wasn't always meant to be cruel, not explicitly. It was just a fact, an identifier. In a sea of blonde ponytails and pink ribbons at ballet class, my tightly coiled hair was a landmark. At sprawling family gatherings, surrounded by my parents' kind, blue-eyed relatives, I was a cherished but obvious addition, a novelty to be admired. I spent years trying to sand down my own edges, to mute the parts of me that stood out, desperate to just blend in to be Amelia. Not Amelia the adopted one, or Amelia the black one. I learned to laugh off the clumsy questions and the backhanded compliments, developing a thick skin that felt more like a suit of armor I could never take off. "You're so well-spoken," a well-meaning teacher once told me, her voice laced with genuine surprise, as if articulation was a skill I had miraculously acquired against all odds. "Where are you really from?" a friend's parent asked, a polite but unconvinced smile on their face when I answered, for the 100th time, "Upstate New York." Each question was a little paper cut, insignificant on its own, a tiny sting you're supposed to ignore. But 1,000 of them, accumulated over a lifetime, leave 1,000 little scars on your sense of self, a constant reminder that you are perceived as an anomaly. But I was a fighter. I channeled all that frustration, that feeling of otherness, into my education and my career. I graduated at the top of my class from law school, driven by a burning, relentless need to prove myself, though if I were honest, I wasn't always sure to whom. To the teachers who were surprised by my vocabulary. To the parents who saw me as exotic. To a world that seemed to have a box for me that I refused to fit into. My dream was to work in corporate litigation, to earn a place in those high-stakes rooms where the big decisions get made, to be so undeniably excellent that no one could ever again question why I was there. And then I got it. A junior associate position at Lockwood, Finch and Associates, one of the most prestigious and ruthless firms in the city. The office was a temple of glass and steel, a gleaming monument to power and success that stretched into the clouds. Walking through those massive glass doors on my first day, wrapped in the scent of expensive leather and ambition, I felt a profound sense of arrival I had craved my entire life. This was it. This was the arena where my hard work would finally pay off, where I'd be defined not by the color of my skin or the story of my birth, but by the sharpness of my intellect and the quality of my work. For the first few months, it was everything I'd ever hoped for. The work was brutally tough, the hours were insane, stretching long into the night, but I was thriving on the challenge. I was assigned to a high-profile team, working directly under two senior associates, Mark and Sarah. Mark was the classic golden boy, effortlessly charming and radiating a confidence born from a family legacy at the firm. Sarah was sharp, intensely ambitious, and meticulously put together, always watching, always calculating, her mind a steel trap. All I wanted was their approval, their validation. I put my head down, did the work, volunteered for the hardest assignments, and tried to find my place in their orbit. The cracks started small, hairline fractures in the perfect facade of my dream job. They were microaggressions, the same kind I dealt with my whole life, but now they came with a professional, corporate gloss. My ideas, offered in strategy meetings, would be met with polite silence, only to be praised as brilliant when Mark repeated them, almost verbatim, 5 minutes later. Sarah would compliment my outfits with a patronizing tone. "It's so great that you bring so much personality to your wardrobe," which I knew was code for, "Your clothes aren't as conservative and bland as ours." It was the corporate version of being told I was well-spoken. They were small, insidious things, easy to dismiss on their own. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that I was the new person on the team. I just had to work harder, prove my value and earn my spot. But that old familiar feeling of being the other began to creep back in. A cold draft I thought I'd finally outrun. It was in the way conversations would abruptly stop when I walked up to the coffee machine, then resume with forced, awkward laughter. It was in the way I'd be conspicuously left off email chains for after-work drinks, only to see pictures of the team together on social media the next day. I was on the team but not in the circle. The worst of it, the part that truly began to wear me down, came during lunch. Mark and Sarah had this edgy sense of humor they were incredibly proud of. It was always at someone else's expense, but always carefully packaged so it could be denied as just a joke. And more I felt like the punchline. They became fascinated, almost obsessed with my adoption. "So, do you know anything about your real parents?" Mark asked one day, leaning back in his chair with a casualness that made my skin crawl, as if he were asking about the weather. The phrase real parents stung like a slap. My entire body tensed. "My parents in New York are my real parents," I said, my voice tighter and colder than I intended. Sarah just offered a little pitying smile, the kind one gives a stray animal. "Oh, you know what he means, Amelia. Your birth parents." I tried to shut it down, politely but firmly. I told them it was a private matter and that I didn't like to discuss it. But my reticence, my clear discomfort, only made them more curious. It was like blood in the water. They saw my boundary not as something to be respected, but as a wall hiding a juicy mystery they were entitled to solve. They weren't digging out of overt malice, not then. They were digging out of a profound and privileged ignorance, a complete inability to comprehend that this wasn't just a fun fact or a piece of trivia about me. It was the foundational wound of my life, the source of a quiet, persistent ache of wondering why. Why was I given away? It was the single most painful question of my existence, a question I had buried deep under layers of ambition and achievement, and they were treating it like idle office gossip. The dream was starting to fray at the edges, the vibrant colors fading to a dull gray. The gleaming glass tower of Lockwood, Finch, and Associates felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. I felt that old familiar exhaustion setting in. The exhaustion of performing, of explaining, of absorbing the little cuts and pretending they didn't bleed. But I held on, gritting my teeth and telling myself it would get better. I just had to endure. I had no idea the real nightmare was just about to begin. The day it all fell apart started like any other grueling day at the firm. We were deep in the discovery phase for a major client, drowning in mountains of documents and the stale, recycled air of a conference room that smelled of stress and burnt coffee. The whole team was gathered, staring at a whiteboard covered in frantic scribbles, trying to figure out our next move in a case that was becoming more complex by the hour. We were on a short break when Mark, in an attempt to lighten the suffocating mood, started telling a story about trying to buy a new car over the weekend. "My wife wanted the white one, I wanted the black one," he said with a dramatic sigh, playing to the exhausted audience. A total impasse. It was a real crisis in the household. He paused, looking around the room for effect, letting the minor domestic drama hang in the air. And then his eyes landed on me. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. It was the kind of predatory grin that screams a punchline is coming, and a cold, heavy knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach. I knew with sickening, absolute certainty that I was the target. "You know," he said, raising his voice so that everyone, including the paralegals in the corner, would hear, "I should have just pulled an Amelia's parents. When you can't decide between black and white, you just get one of each." Silence. Absolute, crushing, pin-drop silence. For one single, solitary second, the world just stopped turning. The casual, breathtaking cruelty of it. The way he took the most personal, defining, and painful fact of my existence and twisted it into a cheap, ugly punchline for the amusement of our colleagues, sucked all the air from my lungs. It wasn't just a thoughtless joke about race. It was a joke that invalidated my family, that reduced my very being to a consumer choice, a quirky compromise. He wasn't just mocking me. He was mocking the entire architecture of my life. Sarah let out a sharp, surprised laugh, then quickly tried to smother it with a cough, her eyes wide. A few of the junior paralegals shuffled their papers, their eyes darting anywhere but at me, their sudden focus on their documents a testament to their discomfort. The silence that followed his words was even worse than the joke itself. It was heavy, suffocating, and accusatory. I could feel every eye in that room on me, waiting, watching. Would I laugh it off to prove I could take a joke? Would I get angry and prove I was oversensitive? Would I cry and prove I was weak? My face felt like it was on fire, but my hands were ice cold. I looked directly at Mark, who was still smiling, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face, completely oblivious, or perhaps chillingly indifferent, to the deep wound he'd just inflicted. A lifetime of buried anger, of quiet pain, of feeling like an outsider, surged to the surface like magma. But my training, my decades of learning to absorb, deflect, and survive, kicked in on pure instinct. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "I need some air," I mumbled, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger, thin and reedy. I walked out of that room with my back ramrod straight, my chin held high. I didn't run. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I walked down the long, quiet hall, my heels clicking a furious rhythm on the marble floor, into the opulent lady's room, and locked myself in a stall. Only then, in the cold, anonymous privacy of the cubicle, did I let the tears fall. They weren't just tears of hurt. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. Rage at them for their casual cruelty. Rage at a world that constantly, in 1,000 different ways, reminded me I didn't quite belong. And a hot, burning rage at myself for not saying anything, for not shouting at him, for not making him choke on his ugly words. That was the breaking point. The dream job was now a source of daily, gut-wrenching anxiety. The office, once a symbol of my success, felt like enemy territory. I couldn't let it go. This wasn't another paper cut. This was a deep, gaping gash. I did what you're supposed to do. Followed protocol. I scheduled a meeting with human resources. The HR manager, a woman named Linda with a practiced, neutral expression and a wardrobe of beige suits, listened to me with a kind of detached patience. I explained the pattern of exclusion, the constant, intrusive questions about my adoption, and finally the joke. I laid it all out, my voice shaking with residual anger and humiliation as I recounted Mark's exact words. When I finished, my story hanging in the sterile air between us, Linda nodded slowly, a carefully calibrated gesture of sympathy. "Amelia," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of empty corporate speak that means nothing, "I understand you're feeling hurt. However, you have to understand the high-pressure environment here at Lockwood, Finch. Mark is one of our top performers, and his sense of humor, while perhaps a bit unconventional, is part of how his team bonds. Are you sure you're not being a little oversensitive? From where I'm sitting, it just sounds like a joke that didn't land well." Oversensitive. The word was a slap in the face, more stunning than the joke itself. It was the classic, textbook gaslighting maneuver, designed to shift the blame from the perpetrator to the victim. My pain wasn't valid. It was a character flaw. She was telling me, in the politest way possible, that the problem wasn't the racism, it was my reaction to the racism. She ended the meeting by suggesting I take a resilience workshop the firm offered. I walked out of her office in a complete daze. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The institution I had placed my faith in, the system I had worked so hard to become a part of, hadn't just failed to protect me. It had actively sided with my tormentors. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My confidential complaint to HR was anything but. Word got back to Mark and Sarah almost immediately. Their passive aggressiveness turned into open, undisguised hostility. I was iced out of important meetings. I was left off crucial project emails. My completed work was scrutinized for the smallest, most insignificant errors, which were then documented and flagged as major failures. They were building a case against me, meticulously laying a paper trail to paint me as incompetent and unstable. 2 weeks later, the axe fell. I was called into a senior partner's opulent office. He and Linda from HR were waiting for me. He informed me, with a grim and theatrical seriousness, that there had been a serious breach of client confidentiality. A key file from our case, containing sensitive trade secrets, had allegedly been accessed from my computer after hours and downloaded to an external device. They accused me of corporate espionage. It was a complete and utter setup, so blatant and clumsy it was almost laughable. But they were powerful and I was disposable. I was fired on the spot and escorted out of the building by a stoic security guard, who carried a box with a sad collection of my desk belongings. As I stood on the sidewalk in the middle of the afternoon, the city rushing past me, holding that cardboard box of shattered dreams, the full, crushing weight of the injustice hit me. They hadn't just fired me. They had tried to systematically ruin my career and blacklist me from the legal profession. My parents, John and Mary, were horrified and furious. Their quiet, gentle love turned into a righteous anger on my behalf. They urged me to fight back, to not let them get away with it. And all that simmering anger I had suppressed for so long finally found a direction. This was no longer about a hurtful joke or my feelings. This was about my future, my name, and my integrity. I found a lawyer, a sharp, tenacious woman named Maria who specialized in wrongful termination and discrimination cases. We filed a lawsuit against Lockwood, Finch, and Associates. I was no longer a victim. I was a plaintiff. And my case, through a random act of judicial assignment, was placed on the docket for the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Elizabeth Caldwell. The first day of the trial felt utterly surreal. Sitting in that hallowed wood-paneled courtroom, I was a storm of conflicting emotions, terrified and determined all at once. This was the world I had dreamed of joining, the very arena I had aspired to, yet here I was on the other side of it, cast as the enemy. Lockwood, Finch, and Associates had a team of high-priced lawyers, led by Mr. Peterson. He was the living embodiment of corporate arrogance, and he looked at me not as a person, but as a nuisance, a bug to be swatted away with legal motions and condescending tactics. Across the room, Mark and Sarah sat with their legal team, looking smug and self-assured. They avoided my gaze, whispering to their lawyers, ready to repeat the carefully constructed lies they had built to destroy my career. And then there was Judge Elizabeth Caldwell. She entered the courtroom with an aura of immense, unshakable authority. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an expression that tolerated zero nonsense. Her reputation was legendary. She was known for being tough but fair, incredibly perceptive, and possessing a mind that could cut through legal obfuscation like a surgeon's scalpel. Seeing her, I felt a small, fragile flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she would be the one person to see through the lies. The first few days were a blur of dense legal maneuvering. Peterson relentlessly painted me as a disgruntled, underperforming employee lashing out because she couldn't handle the pressure. He presented doctored performance reviews and selectively edited emails, all carefully put together by Mark and Sarah after my HR complaint to create a false narrative of my incompetence. My lawyer Maria fought back hard, chipping away at their story, trying to establish a clear pattern of harassment and a retaliatory motive for my firing. The turning point came when Maria called me to the stand. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure the microphone would pick it up as I swore the oath. Maria calmly, gently, led me through my story, starting with my background. "Ms. Harris," she began, her voice steady and reassuring, "could you please tell the court a little about your family?" "I was adopted as an infant," I said, my voice remarkably clear despite the tremor in my hands. "I was raised in upstate New York by my parents, John and Mary Harris." "And what is your racial background and that of your adoptive parents?" she asked. "I am a black woman. My parents are white." I felt a subtle shift in the energy of the room, a change in the atmospheric pressure. This was the heart of it, the core issue they wanted to exploit. I could feel Peterson and his team leaning forward, like wolves sensing weakness, getting ready to pounce, to frame this very fact as the source of my supposed oversensitivity. Maria continued, "Did your background ever come up during your time at Lockwood, Finch?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "Frequently." I recounted the intrusive questions about my real parents, the backhanded compliments about my speech and my clothing, and then Maria asked the question that would change everything. "Ms. Harris, can you describe for the court the specific incident that prompted you to file a formal complaint with Human Resources?" I took a deep, shuddering breath. My eyes flickered toward Mark, who was now staring intently at his hands on the table. "My colleagues, they made a joke." I recounted the story about the car, my voice dropping to just above a whisper as I repeated the punchline that was seared into my brain. He said, "When you can't decide between black and white, you just get one of each." A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Peterson was on his feet in an instant. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Ms. Harris's feelings about a poorly landed office joke have no bearing on her subsequent termination for corporate espionage." "Sustained," Judge Caldwell said, her voice flat, betraying no emotion. But her eyes lingered on me for a fraction of a second too long. "Stick to the timeline, counsel." Maria nodded. "The joke was the inciting incident, Your Honor. It is directly relevant to establishing the hostile work environment that led to the retaliatory and false accusation that followed." "I'll allow it for now," the judge said, waving a dismissive hand. "But tread carefully. Proceed." Peterson's cross-examination was as brutal as I had feared. He came at me with everything he had. His questions designed to dismantle my credibility and paint me as fragile and emotionally unstable. "Ms. Harris," he began, pacing before me like a caged tiger. "Corporate law is a tough business, a high-stakes game. Wouldn't you agree?" "Yes. And a certain amount of thick skin is required to succeed, is it not? There is a profound difference between professional toughness and enduring personal insults based on one's race and family, I shot back, my voice gaining strength. He smirked, a cruel twisting of his lips. So this joke, as you call it, you found it deeply offensive? Yes, I did. So offensive, in fact, that it sent you into an emotional spiral, leading you to fabricate this entire story of being framed to cover up for your own professional failings. Objection! Maria shouted, her voice ringing out. Counsel is badgering the witness and making baseless accusations. Sustained, Judge Caldwell said sharply, her gaze fixed on Peterson. Mr. Peterson, watch it. That's your first warning. But he wasn't done. He circled back, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, to the one topic I prayed he would leave alone. My adoption. Ms. Harris, do you have any knowledge of who your birth mother is? Objection. Maria was on her feet again, her face flushed with anger. Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant, deeply inappropriate, and serves only to harass my client. Where are you going with this, Mr. Peterson? The judge asked, her brow furrowed in a warning. I am establishing a pattern, Your Honor, Peterson said smoothly, his confidence unshaken. A pattern of deep-seated insecurity that has made Ms. Harris hypersensitive to any perceived slight. I believe her extreme reaction to a simple office joke is rooted not in the joke itself, but in her own unresolved issues surrounding her abandonment as a child. It was the lowest of blows, a truly despicable tactic. He was weaponizing my deepest vulnerabilities, twisting my personal history into a tool to discredit me in open court. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and stinging, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give him the satisfaction. Your Honor, Maria pleaded, her voice filled with outrage. This is nothing more than a character assassination. But Judge Caldwell didn't seem to hear her. She was staring at Peterson, a strange, unreadable look on her face. Mr. Peterson, she said slowly, her voice suddenly strained tight. Repeat the basis for your line of questioning. Sensing he'd struck a nerve, that he was onto something, Peterson puffed out his chest. I am arguing, Your Honor, that my client's harmless joke was grossly misinterpreted by Ms. Harris due to her personal history. An unknown birth mother, a feeling of not belonging. And that's when it happened. As Peterson uttered the words unknown birth mother, all the color drained from Judge Elizabeth Caldwell's face. Her hand, which had been resting on a stack of legal papers, started to shake violently. Her eyes, fixed on me, widened with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. It was more than shock, it was horror. It was the look of someone seeing a ghost walk through the wall. The courtroom fell completely, utterly silent. Peterson's oily voice trailed off as he realized no one was listening to him anymore. Maria stared, her mouth slightly agape. Mark and Sarah exchanged confused, worried glances. Judge Caldwell opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked as if she was struggling for air, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her gaze was locked on mine, a prisoner to it, and in the depths of her eyes, I saw a raging storm of fear, regret, and a profound, bottomless sorrow that seemed to span decades. Her gavel, which she had picked up moments before to rule on the last objection, slipped from her trembling, nerveless fingers and fell to her desk with a soft, muffled thud. The sound was deafening in the dead silence of the room. She froze, completely and utterly frozen. The powerful, unflappable, legendary Judge Elizabeth Caldwell was paralyzed on the bench. And she couldn't take her eyes off me. That silence stretched for an eternity, thick with confusion and disbelief. Court officers started to shift on their feet, their eyes darting between each other and the bench, totally unsure of what to do. What is the protocol for when the absolute center of all authority in the room just stops? Judge Caldwell's eyes were still locked on me, and for the first time, I saw past the intimidating black robe. I saw a woman who looked like she was drowning in plain sight. With what seemed like a monumental effort of will, she tore her gaze away from me and looked at the sea of stunned faces around her. This court, she said, her voice a raw, broken whisper that barely carried across the room, is in recess. Immediately. She didn't wait for a response or a formal adjournment. She stood on visibly unsteady legs and practically fled through the side door to her chambers, leaving a maelstrom of confusion in her wake. The courtroom instantly erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. Maria rushed to my side, her face a mask of concern. "Amelia, what in the world was that? Do you know her?" "No," I whispered back, my own mind reeling, trying to process the impossible scene. "I've never seen her before in my life." We were told to wait in the now empty courtroom. An hour passed, feeling like a lifetime. Then two. The uncertainty was excruciating. Finally, a bailiff approached our table, his expression grim. "Judge Caldwell's clerk would like to see you and your client in chambers. Now," he pointedly added, "counsel for the defense is to remain here." This was unheard of, a massive, shocking breach of judicial protocol. Maria was clearly hesitant, but you don't refuse a summons from a federal judge. The judge's chambers were large and imposing, lined floor to ceiling with thick law books that smelled of old paper and authority. Judge Caldwell was standing by the tall window with her back to us, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The formidable judge who had commanded the courtroom was gone. In her place was a woman who seemed fragile and broken. When she turned to face us, her eyes were red and swollen. She had been crying and crying hard. She looked at Maria first, her professional mask slipping back on, however ill-fitting it now was. "Counselor," she said, her voice still trembling, "I will be recusing myself from this case, effective immediately. The reason will be filed under seal as a conflict of interest, so profound it would invalidate any ruling I could possibly make." Maria opened her mouth to ask the obvious question, "Why?" But the judge raised a shaking hand to stop her. Her eyes moved to me, a gaze so intense it felt like it was peeling back every layer of my identity, searching for something deep inside me. "Maria," she said, her voice catching on a sob she tried to suppress. Could you please give us a moment? Please." Maria looked at me, a silent question in her eyes, asking if I was okay. I gave a tiny, uncertain nod. I was terrified, adrift in a sea of confusion, but I had to understand what was happening. Maria gave my arm a reassuring squeeze and quietly exited the room, closing the heavy door behind her. Now, it was just the two of us, surrounded by the weight of the law and a silence even heavier than the one in the courtroom. "Amelia," the judge began, and the way she said my name was not formal, not judicial. It was achingly, strangely familiar. "You said on the stand you were adopted as an infant. From where? What city?" "A hospital in Albany, New York," I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "St. Mary's Hospital." She closed her eyes, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "I knew it," she breathed, a sound of utter devastation. She walked on unsteady feet to her massive mahogany desk, and picked up a silver-framed photo that was facing away from us. With a trembling hand, she turned it around. It was a picture of a much younger woman, no older than 21, with the same sharp eyes and strong jawline as the judge, but her face was full of youthful hope and anxiety. She was holding a newborn baby, swaddled in a simple hospital blanket. The baby's tiny, dark-skinned hand was curled tightly around the young woman's finger. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked from the photograph to the judge's face, and back again. The resemblance was undeniable, a ghost image from the past. The woman in the photo was her. When Mr. Peterson kept saying, "unknown birth mother," she said, her voice thick with tears she no longer tried to hide, I thought my heart was going to stop beating. Because she isn't unknown. Not to me. She looked right into my eyes, her gaze holding all the pain of the last 32 years. "My name is Elizabeth Caldwell. But 32 years ago I was just Liz. A scared, ambitious, 21-year-old law student from a powerful family with rigid, unforgiving expectations. I fell in love with a man my family would never, ever approve of. A brilliant, kind artist. A black man. The world tilted on its axis, the solid ground beneath my feet turning to sand. My mind was scrambling, failing to connect her words to the impossible, earth-shattering reality that was taking shape in front of me. We had a plan, she continued, her voice distant, lost in the painful memory. We were going to finish school, get married, and build a life far away from my family's influence. But I got pregnant. And then he was killed. A hit-and-run driver just a month before you were born. And I was completely alone. My family saw not my grief, but an opportunity to avoid a scandal that could ruin my father's political career. They gave me an ultimatum, a choice no child should have to make. I could keep my baby, be disowned, disgraced, and forfeit my entire future, or I could agree to a closed adoption. They promised me they would ensure you went to a good family, a family that could give you everything that I, a shamed, grieving, penniless student, couldn't. She was sobbing openly now, deep, gut-wrenching sobs of decades-old grief. I was a child myself, Amelia. I was terrified and grieving and broken, and I made an impossible choice. The worst, most selfish choice of my life. I signed the papers. I let them take you from my arms. And I have lived with the ghost of that decision every single day for 32 years. She took a shaky, hesitant step towards me. I didn't know where you were. The adoption was sealed tight. My father made sure of it. All I knew was the name I gave you. Amelia. I chose that name for you. I prayed every single night that you were safe and happy and loved. And then today, you walked into my courtroom. And when I heard your story, your name, your upbringing, it was like the last 30 years vanished. All I could see was my baby. The disparate, mismatched puzzle pieces of my life, the ones that never fit, slammed into place with the force of a tidal wave. The feeling of not belonging, the endless questions without answers, the deep, unnameable ache that had lived in the center of my being for as long as I could remember. It all made a terrible, heartbreaking, devastating kind of sense. This woman, this powerful, intimidating federal judge, was my mother. The shock was so immense, so total that I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at the woman who had just detonated my entire reality. The woman who gave me life and then gave me away. The moments that followed were a chaotic blur of raw, unfiltered emotion. All the anger I had felt on the witness stand, the humiliation from the joke, the righteous fury at my firm, it all seemed to evaporate, replaced by a feeling so vast and overwhelming I couldn't put a name to it. It was 32 years of grief. It was a lifetime of confusion turning into a terrible clarity. It was rage at a choice I couldn't comprehend. And beneath it all, the tiny, wounded, abandoned child inside me was crying out. Why? The word escaped my lips, a choked, broken sound. It was the only question that mattered. Why didn't you ever look for me? I couldn't, she wept, her voice fractured. It was a condition of the adoption my father forced on me. He was a powerful man, connected at every level of state politics. He had the records sealed in a way that no one could unseal them. He told me that if I ever tried, I would not only fail, but I would risk disrupting your life, undoing the gift of a stable home he had arranged. He convinced me that the greatest act of love I could show you was to stay away. And like a fool, a scared and broken child myself, I believed him. She collapsed into her leather desk chair, burying her face in her hands. I built this entire life, this career, this fortress of law and order, all on the foundation of that one terrible lie I told myself. I told myself I was honoring you by becoming someone of consequence, but the truth is, it was all just a monument to my own cowardice. I just stood there, a statue in the center of her office, watching her. This woman who was a complete stranger and yet the very core of my origin story. My mind flashed to my parents, John and Mary, whose gentle, steady, unwavering love had been my only anchor in a life of quiet confusion. I thought of all the years I'd searched for a hint of my features in my white family's faces and found absolutely none. Now I was looking at my own eyes, my own bone structure, my own hands, in the face of this weeping, broken woman. "I've watched you," she admitted, her voice muffled by her hands. "After my father passed away 10 years ago, I hired a private investigator. Not to interfere, I was too afraid for that. Just to know if you were okay. I know where you went to school. I have a picture of you from your law school graduation. I was so proud, Amelia. So proud it physically hurt. When your case was assigned to my docket, I saw your name, and I told myself it had to be a coincidence, that the universe couldn't be so cruel and so kind at the same time. But seeing you, hearing your story, I knew God or fate or whatever you want to call it, had brought my greatest sin and my greatest love right into my courtroom. Just then, Maria knocked softly and re-entered, her face etched with concern. She took in the devastating scene, me frozen, Elizabeth sobbing, and her professional demeanor kicked in like a shield. "Judge," she said gently, her voice soft but firm. "Amelia, whatever is happening here, we need to handle it carefully and correctly." Elizabeth nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She seemed to pull the heavy robe of her authority back around her shoulders, though it was now a poor fit over her shattered composure. "You're right. My recusal stands. Judge Peterson will take over the case. I will speak to him myself under seal to explain the necessity." The news of a federal judge recusing herself mid-trial for a profound conflict of interest sent shockwaves through the local legal community. The trial was postponed indefinitely. Stunned, scrambling, and now facing a new, highly skeptical judge who was undoubtedly aware that something highly irregular had occurred, Lockwood, Finch, and associates folded immediately. Their lawyers reached out with an offer for a substantial settlement. It included a public letter of apology, the immediate termination of both Mark and Sarah, a complete, externally audited overhaul of their HR policies and training, and a financial sum that was more than I could have imagined. It wasn't a dramatic trial victory, but it was justice. It was complete and total vindication. But the legal victory, as monumental as it was, felt secondary, like a distant echo of the true earthquake that had reshaped my world. A few days later, my phone rang with a call from a private number. It was Elizabeth. "I know I have no right to ask this," she said, her voice small and hesitant, stripped of all its former authority. "But would you be willing to meet me? Not as a judge. Just as Liz." We met for coffee in a small, anonymous cafe far from the courthouse district. There were no robes, no gavels, just two women with a 32-year chasm of pain and silence between them. It was profoundly awkward and deeply painful. There were long gulfs of silence where neither of us knew what to say. There were more tears, this time from both of us. I asked her about my biological father, the artist. She told me his name was Samuel. She shared stories of his infectious laugh, his passion for justice, his talent. For the first time in my life, a piece of my identity that had been a complete and total blank was filled with vibrant color. She never once asked for my forgiveness. She simply offered me the truth, in all its ugly, heartbreaking, and complicated detail. And I listened, absorbing the story I had unknowingly spent my entire life waiting to hear. Our reunion wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of a slow, difficult, complicated process of building a fragile bridge across a lifetime of separation and secrets. One of the hardest conversations of my life was telling my parents, John and Mary. Their initial reaction was a complex mix of hurt, confusion, and fear that they might lose me. But their love, as it always had been, was unconditional and absolute. They supported me without reservation, my father holding my hand and telling me, "A bigger family just means more love to go around, Amelia. You are our daughter. That will never change." Today, my relationship with Elizabeth is still evolving. Some days she feels like a stranger I am just getting to know. On others, I see a fleeting glimpse of the mother I never had in the way she smiles or tilts her head. We are two people defined by one impossible choice, made by a scared girl long ago, now trying to find our way back to each other across the years. That horrible day in the conference room, I thought a cruel joke had broken me. The day in the courtroom, I thought I had lost everything. But in that single silent moment when the judge froze, I found the truth. I found the missing piece of myself. That joke, meant to shatter my world, instead gave me back my story. My real story. I am no longer defined by a blank space or a painful question. I am the daughter of John and Mary Harris, who raised me with a quiet, boundless, and perfect love. And I am the daughter of Elizabeth Caldwell and Samuel Reed, whose love story was cut short by tragedy, but resulted in me. My identity is no longer a puzzle with a missing piece. It is a rich, complex, beautiful mosaic, finally miraculously complete.